This is a book review for The Wolf of the North by Duncan M. Hamilton. This book was almost exactly what I thought it would be, which was good because that's why I read it. After reading The Black Witch, which I characterized as a person who learns better story, a la Robert Heinlein's 3 Types of Stories, I thought, what other types, can I read the other 2 types of stories that are classic according to that definition of dividing stories? I had a feeling this book would be a classic coming of age story or the little Tailor story type, and I was correct. And it was very well written. One of the things that you always worry about when you read an indie book, pretty sure this is an indie book. Hold on, I'm going to check the publisher. Okay, yep, it's an indie book. So one of the big worries you always have when you read an indie book, of course, is this going to be subpar? Sorry, indies. Look, I'm an indie author myself, but the truth is we know that a lot of authors publish their books before they're ready. So you always wonder, it's a bit of a gamble. Is the writing going to be professional? Is the quality going to be professional? And I'm pleased to say that the writing is absolutely top-notch, rock-solid writing, very professional. Everything about the book was professionally done, even in the beautiful setting of the font and the presentation of the book and the map at the beginning. Very well done, very professional. That's why I even had to check it before I could tell you for sure this was an indie book, because I honestly couldn't tell the difference. And of course, that's what every indie wants for their book, right? You can't tell the difference between this book and something put out there by one of the big 5 in terms of quality. Now, I don't know if the big 5 publishers are still publishing books of this story type, and I wanted to read a classic coming-of-age story of the adventure warrior fantasy type. Now, there's something called military fantasy, which is more about soldiers and armies and strategy at the macro level, even though, of course, you still follow individual characters. But there's another kind of fantasy that I would say is like warrior fantasy, which is not exactly the same as sword and sorcery. There's a certain kind of mood in sword and sorcery. Warrior fantasy has more of the gritty realism that you expect to find in military fantasy. The focus is very much on the individual warrior, his individual battle, coming of age battle. Sometimes he travels with a band of companions, but it's not so much about grand strategy or being embedded in an army as military strategy would be. This coming of age story starts when the hero, Wulfric, is a child, and since it's a trilogy, it ends really in the middle of the story arc of the hero, but after he's achieved manhood and proven himself as a warrior, and then there's a cliffhanger at the end, which I'll tell you after I get past the no spoilers portion of the review. In terms of story structure, the way it's told is that there is a meta story about a storyteller at an inn who is waiting to meet the main character of the story and decides to tell an epic tale about the main character of the story to the people in the tavern while he waits to meet his friend. And he does this consciously, trying to create a bit of a legend about his friend, and yet he doesn't know how the story is going to end himself because he's part of the story he's telling. I thought that was a pretty cool frame. I liked it. Sometimes when you have a frame where somebody is telling a story and the story you're reading is really just a tale being told, it can have a distancing effect, almost breaking the 4th wall, even if the storyteller is part of the world that he's telling the stories about. It feels a little more distancing, but instead this, because the main character telling the story was actually waiting to meet his friend and waiting to find out the end of his own story, it drew me into the story even more because I wanted to know what is going to happen. How are these 2 storylines, how is the meta story going to meet up with the main story? That was a cool gimmick. That was a cool thing that drew me in and made me feel more grounded in the story rather than less. So I appreciated the finesse with which that element was handled. The story has around 50 chapters, about 2,000 words each in length, or sometimes a little less. So I'd guess it's about 90 to 100,000 words long. It went pretty fast, so I didn't feel that it didn't drag. Now, the pace was slower than I expected. I honestly, because of the sword on the front, I kind of expected that we were going to have one rollicking adventure after another. And instead what we had was a slow burn coming of age story where the setting of the story was set very well. The characters were very well established, including 2 sets of villains. And we did follow the point of view of the villains. Everything was told in 3rd person past tense. That is my favorite. It had multiple point of view characters. I like that. And it was divided into 3 sections. Although there was also a perceivable 4-act structure, because at the midpoint of the story, exactly 50% of the way through, was a very critical turning point in the character's storyline. I talked before about how your mythological story should speak on a deeper level than a simple analogy to any period in time, and yet you can use analogies to periods in history to help the reader ease into your world, and you gradually distinguish the elements that are unique to the fantasy world that you're writing about, while at the same time you kind of lean on the reader's implicit implicit understanding of the period that you're writing about to kind of flush out the rest of the story until you get those details flushed out to distinguish it and make it feel alive in a unique world. So the author has drawn on Scottish and English history, I'd say probably based on the fact that he's using a rapier around 17th century, so the 1600s, a very swashbuckling era, and an era when Scotland was undergoing a lot of changes in the socioeconomic system, and that comes into play later in the book. The early part of the story deals with the hero. He starts out as very low status in the village. His father is very high status. His father is first warrior, which is an elected position, but also a position based on military prowess. Well, not exactly military prowess, warrior prowess. And that's important because one of the things that does become a theme in the book is what is the difference between a warrior and a soldier, and what is the difference between a warrior society and a society that has soldiers. So we see not only the hero himself changing, but the society as a whole transitioning from a sort of younger state to a older, more sophisticated, maybe a little more jaded state of being. That's a very interesting parallel that is not consciously harped upon in the book, but comes out through the story, through the subtext. From now on, I may start throwing in spoilers, so I'm just going to go ahead and put the spoiler alert up here. I won't give complete spoilers for the book, but I like to talk about the story from beginning to end because I like to analyze it. So if you really don't want to have any spoilers, go read the book now. I do recommend it if you like warrior fantasy fiction, coming of age story, and it does have a love story, but it's not a romance. All right, now let's get into a more detailed analysis of the story, what made it work, what the strengths and weaknesses were. Pacing was a little bit slow, and so it did take me a little bit more to get into it. There was a payoff for this slow pacing later on that makes me reluctant to say that it should necessarily have been written differently, or at least if I were giving advice to the author, I wouldn't know how to say to improve it. That's not saying much because I don't know everything there is to know about writing, but even as a reader, nothing in retrospect jumps out at me as how it could have been improved. So sometimes, even at the risk of losing your more impatient readers, and maybe some of your younger readers, since they, let's be honest, tend to be the more impatient ones, it's worth it, especially if your target audience is a little older and more mature and can handle a story. In this case, I stuck with it. It wasn't really a big sacrifice or anything. I still wanted to see where it was going to go. The adventure built up in a very good way. So the slower pace at the beginning had a purpose. It was to really very finely paint this world so that when the threat to the world came in the third part of the book, I really felt a sense of sadness at what was being lost because the author had spent the time to build up the village life as it was traditionally. Then in the third part of the book, there comes a threat to their entire way of life. And I really felt a pang, like, oh my gosh, everything is going to change. It's never going to be the same again. And I felt the same kind of sadness for that the main character did. I wouldn't have felt that if the author hadn't taken the time to patiently build through the cycles of life at the beginning of the story. And I don't want to make it sound like it was just a snooze fest at the beginning either, because the character already begins with a really strong conflict. He's a nice guy, but he's the kind of fat, flabby kid that everybody in the village beats up. And his father, who is a very strong and brawny warrior and the first warrior in the village, is ashamed of him, and he knows he is not living up to his father's expectations, and that breaks his heart. But he doesn't know how to do anything about it, and he doesn't know how to stop the bullying. Meanwhile, he also has a best friend, and that is one of the village girls. Even though he's engaged to be married, he was betrothed as a young child by his parents to another girl who simply views him with contempt, and he returns the favor. He doesn't care for her at all. So one of the things that's very interesting about this story, in point of fact, if you go through the elements of the culture in this book and compare it to, say, the elements of the culture in The Black Witch. The Black Witch showed a dystopia, a terrible world where there were arranged marriages, there were differences in caste, there were strong feelings of nationalism on the part of all the different groups of people, there was war, and all of this together was presented as this horrific dystopia because it was being constantly compared by implication to the highest and most politically correct values of current year. This book, I think, did a much better job at portraying the story, the society in the story, from within the values of the people who were living in that society. It's almost the same kind of society. There's arranged marriages, there's differences in caste, they're constantly under the threat of war. But it's not portrayed as a dystopia, and it doesn't feel like a dystopia. On the contrary, it feels just like a very human society with its good elements, its bad elements, its beautiful parts parts of life and its difficult parts of life. In the first part of the book, he does make the decision to change his status, and he does this very actively by training to become a warrior. First, he goes on a life-changing hunt with his father. Then he begins to enter warrior training. He's behind all the other warriors because he's 2 years behind. He was in regular school learning to read and write, although it's not clear how well that took because he's definitely not of a scholarly bent. So he starts practicing extra outside of the regular training, and he makes the effort to transform himself. And so this is the beginning of this coming of age story. And I like how it's not just handed to him on a silver platter. He's really clearly working for it. So later on, when some special gifts do get handed to him, seemingly by the mere grace of the gods, you can see maybe it's not just the mere grace of the gods, but there is something that he himself has contributed to this change in status. And I liked that element of it. I also liked his relationship with his parents. They felt very realistic. He had conflict with them, and yet it was clearly a loving relationship with them as well. Sometimes, especially in young adult literature, the relationship with the parents is either ridiculously hostile or they're dead. And those are your two options. Now, in the second part of the book, we continue with the coming of age story, but now the stakes are raised. We've been following two different sets of bad guys, and some of their shenanigans come to light, and there's a war between his village and another village, and the other village blames his village. The other village blames his village for some cattle rustling that's been going on. Because one of the bad guys from his village has been involved in the cattle rustling, it's a very interesting situation because there's no clear-cut bad guys in the villages. Obviously, the cattle rustlers are not good characters. They are part of the bad guys. But what I like is that they can go to war with this other village. They're kind of driven to it. Both sides have reasons for doing the war, and yet there's no easy solution to get out of it. It's not like they could just sit down, talk it out, share all their information, and everybody would believe everybody else, because every side has too strong a reason to believe the other side would lie, and too strong a motive to lie about what they might be doing if they were actually guilty of what each side thinks they are guilty of. I hope that's not too confusing. The point is, it's a very realistically portrayed war. There's no easy answers in this story, and I think that's why the world, even though it's certainly not perfect, doesn't come across as a dystopia, because it doesn't pretend that there's some easy solution or some easily seen path that they could be taking that they all choose not to take. It's just a human society, and they have human foibles, and war is part of it. Unfortunately, this leads to tragedy for our hero. His father dies in the war. His love interest goes away to the university, which is also an interesting parallel to me with the Black Witch. Of course, this is told from the point of view of the young man, but the young woman he loves goes away to the university, and she's completely changed by it. So that's another element in the story. It remains the rural warrior with the rural old-fashioned values, and she's gone off to the university and imbibed a somewhat different set of values. She's come back speaking a slightly different accent, dressing a different way. So I thought that was a very interesting look at it, especially considering reading the book The Black Witch right before this book. For me, that was a funny contrast. All right, the review is getting a little bit long, and I don't want to spend too long on it. So let me just get to the third element. And up until this point in the story, we've seen a static society with a changing individual. He is adapting to his society as it is. He is coming of age. He is learning to have a different status within that society. Now in the third part, because of the shenanigans of the two villains, we see his society itself is under threat and begins to change. What happens is, as a consequence of the war, the village is devastated. They need some help. And the person who instigated the war in the first place steps in and says, why don't we ask for help with our southern neighbors? Again, remember, this is kind of a pastiche on Scottish English history, and the hero is the Scot, the northerner. And so we know that the southerners are not going to be the good guys in this scenario. So sure enough, when they come in, they basically end up planning to annex his entire village. The price they demand for their protection is pretty much the entire way of life of his people. So he is obviously not happy about that, but he also feels very powerless to deal with it, because all of the things that he has just spent the whole book up until now, the first 2/3 of the book, achieving, learning to become a warrior, are suddenly out of date in the third part of the book. And that was a fantastic twist. It wasn't super dramatic, but it was deep. It was a deep twist to the story. It was subtle, and it comes to threaten him directly when it turns out that the bad guys, of course, have designs on his true love. And so in the third part part of the book, we now see him directly threatened by the shenanigans of the bad guys as they plot to murder him and kidnap her to be made into the mistress of some southern nobleman. Now you may be wondering, well, this all so far sounds like it could be a historical novel. Where is the fantasy element? There is a fantasy element. It's also realistically done, if that makes sense. Some kinds of fantasy are over the top. I myself tend to write over the top magical systems. Not saying I mean to, but it just happens. Some writers are, however, are very deft at much more subtle systems of magic. I really admire that, even though I'm not very good at it myself. The system of the magic in this book is very subtle. You could almost imagine it's still a historical story because you don't know exactly how much is their belief in the magic that makes it happen or how much there really are gods and magic and so on. Part of the initiation when they become men is to touch this to climb a mountain. It's very dangerous because they don't have mountain climbing equipment. They actually have to go up high enough on the mountain that is very dangerous for human beings without special gear. And of course they don't understand why that is, but they suffer from it. So not everybody who tries to do it succeeds. And that was actually a really exciting part of the second act, by the way, which I smoothed over. He touches a magical stone when he's up there and it does something special to him, but he doesn't know what. The priest in the village tells him, you may have been given special gifts and you won't know what they are until you explore them. One of the special gifts appears to be that he goes into a berserker rage when he fights. He loses control, but he's also amazingly strong and crazy, berserker rage. Very hard for any of his enemies to stand against him. He's able to defeat a magical beast in that state and so on. By the way, my worries about there not being quite enough fighting and adventuring in the first third of the book were completely set at ease by the second and third of the book because he was constantly getting into these battles against various types of villains, and that's what I wanted to see, these great fight scenes against wild beasts, against rival apprentice warriors, against robbers and bandits, against other kinds of bad guys. So that was fun, and there was a lot of bloodshed and whatnot that was promised by the sword on the cover of the book. When I see a book with a sword on it, I want to see battles in that book. So we did see that. The other magic that I hope will lead to an increasing importance in the later book is that all throughout this book we saw the good priest guarding an ancient relic. It's just this ugly potato-like stone carved with all these runes but has a clear power to it. And the good priest, it seems to be sort of like the ring in the Lord of the Rings in that it can tempt you to do evil, but this good priest is a good enough person that he has not given in to this temptation. However, there's a bad turned evil priest who knows about the stone and has been searching for it. He achieves it, but he's also not able to completely use it. And then there's another bad guy who has been the hero's nemesis throughout the story, his dark alter ego, so to speak, in terms of literary tropes. And by the end of the story, that character acquires the stone power, and we know that's going to be a bad combination because he's very bad seed. He's a wicked person. He has a grudge against the hero, an understandable grudge. He's a very realistically drawn character. It doesn't seem like he's evil for no reason, but his reasons are not good reasons. His reasons are revenge, self-aggrandizement, ambition, and believable as they are, they definitely mark him as a villain, and now he has this power by the end of the first book. So we are set up for some very serious conflict, including magical levels of conflict later in the series, and I look forward to that. I would like to discuss the love story also. When I go into a book like this, where the primary purpose is to discuss the warrior deeds of greatness and glory of the character, I expect that the main values of the story are going to be courage, loyalty, sacrifice, revenge. If there's a love story, I always count that as a bonus. I don't expect it going in. I'm always happy to find one. It really helps draw me in as probably not the main target audience of this book. So that's a great way to kind of expand your audience, by the way. If you're writing, like I would say that the other book I read, The Black Witch, that's young adult, right? So the target audience for that book would have been 14 to 30 female reader. The target for this book probably is about 15 to 45 male reader. I don't actually fit into the target audience of either of those books, but if the book is well written enough or it has other elements that are interesting, you can bring in people who are outside your target demographic by giving them a little subplot or something that can help glue them into your main storyline, which may not be their most strongest interest. Now, of course, I have to give the usual disclaimer that target audiences are not always determined by their age and gender, etc., but statistically speaking, that's how it works, and let's just be realistic about it if we want to sell books. Okay? As a writer, that's my goal. I'm a writer entrepreneur. I want to sell books, so I want to know what the interests of the usual demographics are. Anyway, as I say, this story has a very strong love interest subplot. I wouldn't exactly call it a romance. It's not, the main conflict doesn't really come between the romance, but even there he did an excellent job. I mean, the author did a very good job of creating a little bit of conflict between the heroine and hero, so it's not simply smooth sailing even on that front. Mostly, however, the conflict comes from the outside and the threats are to the heroine and he has to rescue her. Now they have been divided. At the end of the books, each of them has been told that the other is dead, and this was done on the eve of their planned marriage. So it's a very tragic ending of the book, and I loved the romantic element of that. That was just really well done, and I especially appreciated it thrown into this warrior story. That it just had this beautiful love story along the inside of it. And there's a meta level scene where it's justified. We flash back a couple of times throughout the book to the storyteller who's talking about this, and one of the characters challenges him and asks, "What? But I heard about this great hero that he beds 12 maids a night," etc., etc. And the storyteller says, "No, any man can bed 12 maids a night if he has enough money." But it takes a great man to devote his life to one woman. So that promises that this is going to be an epic love story. I'm totally sold on that. I love it. And I like also how the storyteller and the author is alerting the reader that this is not going to be a Conan the Barbarian, love him and leave him many wench kind of story. So if that's the element you're looking for, and there's certainly a place for that, especially in sword and sorcery. And that's why I said this book, I wouldn't really define it as sword and sorcery. It's not non-stop adventure. There's much more character development, and there's certainly much more world building. I actually like that better. I do like a little sword and sorcery every now and then, and there's another review I have that should be up by now, The Black Fortress, which is your classic sword and sorcery if you like that. Although even he doesn't get any wenches in that novella. Poor guy. But I can only take so much sword and sorcery at a time. I liked this book so much that at the end of it I decided to sign up for the author's email list, and then I was told that when I did that I already was on the author's email list, which is strange because I don't remember signing up, so I don't know if that was a mistake in the author's email server or if the author just doesn't send out that many newsletters. It could be either. There are 2 other books in this trilogy. I'm definitely going to read them. I'll try and review them. I do want to wrap this up because it's already pushing on a considerable length, and I'm trying to keep my reviews short and sweet. I need to get my thoughts a little bit more concise. So let me know what you think of the length of this review, if a shorter review is better, or if you like my long blow-by-blow analysis of the entire plot, or if there's something else you would like me to focus on in the reviews. Obviously, I give a lot of spoilers, and I know some people don't like that, but I don't like reviews where I feel like I don't know anything more about the book than I would have gotten from just reading the back of the book. So let me know what you think, how I can be more useful, since the main reason I do these reviews is to share information about books and talk to people out there about them. So that's all I have to say for now. Far out.